Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. We're continuing a series we call Archiving Wheeling Presents Legendary Lesser Known Legends of Wheeling. And today we'll be telling you about some of the African American residents during the Jim Crow era. Before we get to that, a couple of announcements. Our PU live stream, People's University, Physical Science, continues this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. when Dr. Erin Duffy, my sister, who happens to be one of the greatest scientists I know, will teach about the battle against antibiotic-resistant bacteria. We hear a lot about virus with this pandemic, but we mustn't forget MRSA and other bacteria becoming resistant to the very last and best antibiotics we have. So that's the kind of work she does, and she'll tell you about that on Thursday evening. Next Tuesday, on February 9th at noon, African American Civil War Doctors with Jill Newmark. Jill is a historian and worked for the NIH and other places, and will tell you all about some of the surgeons who were African American during the Civil War. Okay, now as you can see, my co-presenter today, Aaron Rothenbuehler, will be switching back and forth on a few of these biographies of 9 accomplished people. And I mentioned that they lived and worked during a period known as Jim Crow, which occurred after Reconstruction and the Civil War, and was really a system of traditions, not just laws, but also laws and policies that tried to keep black and white people separate, primarily because white people did not want black people around. And there was a Supreme Court challenge to that policy based on segregation in trains called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, in which the court upheld these laws and policies as long as the facilities were, let's say, separate, but also equal. I'm sorry, I'm going to put up my PowerPoint here. Bear with me one second. So it's the illustration of Plessy on the right. So separate but equal was what the court announced. Of course, we know in reality that places like Lincoln School, while the human element was superior, the building itself, the facilities were underfunded and inferior in quality. So this notion of separate but equal was, of course, a racist pipe dream. One of the people we'll be talking about today was the only African American attorney in town in 1936 when he delivered a very important speech called Wheeling's 20th Man. And it contains a lot of information about Wheeling under Jim Crow that you will find interesting. You can go on the library's website and search 20th Man to find this speech. You can listen to Ron Scott read it. We recorded him. You can also read the speech while you listen. And he talks about how black people were barred from employment in the local factories and mills and stores. And he describes a Wheeling that was 2 cities, side by side and completely separate. So black people had to have their own doctors and dentists, lawyers, restaurateurs, shopkeepers, barbers, hairdressers, movie theaters, hotels, police, firemen, and even funeral directors. Brown's Funeral Home was the African American funeral home in town at the time. So Wheeling in 36 was, and during Jim Crow, was 2 cities side by side, and black people. This picture is not from Wheeling, but it gives you an idea of some of the things that were faced by black people in town. And you're probably familiar with the Negro Motorist Green Book, which through Hollywood, for better or worse, but a lot of Wheeling businesses that you see there on the right were listed in the book. And basically what it was, when black people traveled, This was a way they could know where they were welcome and not have to suffer the embarrassment of going into a restaurant and being told they could not be served there. So the primary neighborhood that we'll be talking about today was the Chaplin Street neighborhood. So you see here on this fire insurance map, Lincoln School there on the left. So and there's a close-up from Lincoln School southward toward 12th Street, primarily on 11th Street, up the hill toward Grandview, and bordered on the west by Chaplin Street. That's the neighborhood we're talking about that most of these people lived in. And so our caveat. First of all, you're going to hear language today that you may find offensive, but we're doing it for historical accuracy. This is how people referenced Black people. It adds to the authenticity of what we call Jim Crow. And we did this research based primarily on newspaper articles, government documents. There just isn't a lot of information. So we did the best we could, but we deserve, and the reason we're doing this is because we believe these people deserve to be remembered, to be known, first of all, to the white people of Wheeling, and to be remembered by all. But if you happen to be a descendant or know someone who is, and you have photographs or documents or stories that you'd like to share with us, that's part of our mission at the library and the archive at the library, is to preserve this history. So if you're willing to share it, we would welcome that. So with that said, let's start our biographies. And the first person we're remembering today was a man named Henry Boose Clemens. So why am I showing you a Caucasian man named Sherrard Clemens? Well, the reason we'll get to in a moment, but let me just tell you about Sherrard Clemens first. He was born in Wheeling in 1820 and became a lawyer and was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1852 and 56. He infamously described Abraham Lincoln as a cross between a sandhill crane and an Andalusian jackass. So from that, you can deduct that correctly that Clemens was not a Republican at the time and was not a fan of the Republican Party or of those who believed in abolition. In fact, we'll get to that in a moment, but he was a slave owner. He attended the first Wheeling Convention, the convention in 1861 about separating from Virginia, and he opposed both secession and said separation. You may look at his name and think, well, the first name's familiar, and that's because Marshall County city of Sherrard is named after him. And you look at his surname and you think that's familiar, and that's because he was a cousin of this man, Mr. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. He's also infamous for, Sherrard Clemens, that is, for having a duel with the son of the Governor Wise of Virginia, in which he was shot in a very place I won't name, but near his leg. So yeah, he's a cousin of Mark Twain who came to Wheeling in 1872 and probably visited with his cousin. But none of that is the reason that Sherrard Clemens is here. The reason he's here is because he was a slave owner. And here is the last will and testament section by his father, James W. Clemens, in which he, as you can see, leaves a boy, a girl named Emily, and her son Boz, also known as Boose Clemens. So he left a slave to his son. Human property. That's what we're talking about here in Wheeling. And this guy, James, his father, was best known for probably faking the infamous Grave Creek tablet, by the way. So it's a little side story. Boose Clemens was known as picturesque, described as such, and one of the most highly respected colored residents of the Wheeling district, said the newspaper. He married in 1872 a woman from Moundsville named Alice. Have I got the name right? Yes. And I'm sorry, Annie Locke in 1872. And her grandmother was this is another little side story, but she was 114 years old when she died and was known as the oldest woman in West Virginia. The newspaper attributed her longevity to the fact that she smoked a pipe every morning and never wore specs and never rode on a railroad car. So if you want to live long, do smoke a pipe and don't wear specs and don't ride a train. According to the 1880 census, Henry Boose Clay and Selah, it looks like here, his wife, perhaps a nickname, had a daughter named Mamie. And as you can see, they were categorized as mulatto, which of course is a mixed race term used at the time, and right there on the census form. They lived at 1121 Oak Street, which is in that neighborhood I described. And in 1890, the Wheeling Register reported that they adopted a young girl named Hazel Jones Clemens, who was an orphan from Cleveland, and her mother's whereabouts were unknown. In 1882, Henry ran for city council in the second ward. You'll see that is a recurrent theme today with many of the people we'll tell you about. And here the newspaper tries to make a joke. This is pretty typical of the time. The colored troops made an effort for their candidate, Ashby Clemens, but he was slaughtered. So he did not win. His primary occupation was as a barber, and he worked at the McClure, as you can see here, Washington Hall on Market Street, the Grand Opera Building, which replaced it, and the Schmalbach Building, just up the street. One wonders what kind of people he encountered, politicians and big shots in these places. As a barber, he was probably privy to a lot of important conversations, or let's say potentially damaging conversations. So he ended up being a bailiff at the district court, the U.S. Federal District Court for the Northern District of the state. There may be a connection there to his work as a barber. A newspaper account said that he had a ready tongue for wit, and almost every word he uttered filled with humor. Many were the men who enjoyed the time occupied for a shave and a haircut listening to his talk. Many men recalled the boyhood days when their father used to take them to Boose Clemens' barbershop for a haircut, and Boose never seemed to grow weary in spreading a touch of cheerfulness among all white and colored whom he met. So you can imagine in the 19th century, men with various degrees of facial hair and the conditions such as they were, having a shave and a haircut was a very pleasurable experience. And let me go back to that slide while I tell you about an advertisement for the Metropolitan Shaving Salon in the Washington Hall building that Clemens ran with a man named Lewis. There's just a brief passage here because it's so interesting. There's probably nothing in a man's necessities that he is so particular about as his shaving, and this can readily be made a trial or a great pleasure to have your face manipulated when the hirsute appendage is being removed by cool, soft, deft fingers, every movement gentle, every stroke of the keen, well-kept razor almost unfelt, gliding over the face with a soothing, refreshing sensation. You are perfectly clean and smooth before you are aware of it. So there you have it, and they recommend Boose Clemens in the ad. Shaving was an important experience for men of the period. So that probably explains why Boose Clemens had such a prominent former slave in his obituary in 1923 when he died in Detroit when he's living with his daughter. And he is buried at Mountwood Cemetery next to his wife. So Henry Boose Clemens, a very interesting character. And now William Alexander Turner, who I've written about in the past. He is, and you can find that article on Archiving Wheeling. He was Wheeling's first black police officer. He may have been also at other times a bouncer, a brawler, a fighter, a bartender, a barber himself, a baseball player, umpire and coach, a drummer, a dancer, a singer, and a quartet, and a Republican Party activist, as many of these men we'll be talking about, you'll see, and women were active in the Republican Party. Things were different then, right? We'll get to that in a minute. But Mr. Turner was born a few months after the Civil War ended in 1865 in Ward 2 on Chaplin Street in that block in the neighborhood I showed you. And he was in the paper a lot for various deeds. In one case, there was something called hot foot. If you fell asleep at a pub or a saloon, drunk, they would light your foot on fire, basically. And this gentleman, they did this to a man who was drunk at a bar that Mr. Turner was working at as a bouncer, and the man caught on fire. And Turner was the one to put out the fire and save the man's life. So he earned some fame for deeds like that, and for his athleticism, and for his singing. And he was chosen by Governor Hatfield to represent the colored people of West Virginia in Wheeling for the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation held in New York City in 1913, which is a big deal. He started working at the city county building as a janitor, and on August 1899, August 12, the Intelligencer said, Officer William Turner donned his helmet last night and went to work for the Second Ward for the first time. So there you see him with the police of Wheeling, the only African-American at the time. And here he is directing traffic, and the newspaper said he made a brave appearance in his police talks. He was still a working police officer when he died at his home on 114 12th Street, just behind the Blue Church, on September 27, 1928, at the age of 62. And he is buried at Peninsula Cemetery. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague for the next.
All right. The next we'll be talking about a gentleman named Ashby Jackson. He was Wheeling's first black firefighter. Born in 1873 in Haywood, West Virginia, he came to Wheeling around 1896. Shortly thereafter, he became a firefighter with the Wheeling Fire Department in 1897. Here. He was a member of the Second Ward Chemical Engine House number 7 on 11th Street in the Second Ward. He had the rank of captain for many years there. He's shown in this picture here from a yearbook from the Wheeling Fire Department with John Dorfmeyer, who was a pipeman. He joined the department in 1919, and with Archibald Johnson, who joined in 1920. So Ashby had been the only black fireman on the force for 22 years before another African-American man was hired. In 1904, Mr. Jackson was connected to a case that really illustrates some of the abuses of power during Jim Crow Wheeling. Police interfered with black voting that November near the Upper Market House. The newspaper concluded that deliberate methods were used. The policemen had gathered around the polls and began making arrests for trivial matters, claiming that some of the voters had been men that had come from out of state, while others, they had been living in Wheeling, could not claim Wheeling as their permanent home, and they were arresting all these men. The newspaper headline of the day read, "A determined effort to overawe the colored voter was made throughout the day." Democratic Chief of Police John S. Ritz and Republican Prosecuting Attorney Frank W. Nesbitt clashed over the matter, with Nesbitt throughout the day working to help the men who had been wrongfully charged, some while they were in the police wagon. And he was also threatening to have policemen arrested on the day for wrongfully arresting the men. Ashby Jackson's brother was one of the men targeted. Police claimed that he was underage, even though he had proof that he was 22 years old. And he was arrested and locked up during the debacle. In the newspaper, because Ashby was a prominent man, it's the brother of Ashby Jackson, firefighter, in the newspaper. So in 1915, Jackson was one of 6 black city employees to present Dr. Thomas Haskins a gold-hearted cane when he retired from the city's Board of Control. The others were Tom Arrington, who was a police patrol driver, Russell Williams, a janitor at City Hall, Isaac Jones, an employee with the city waterworks, John Dorfmeyer, who we mentioned before, had joined the fire department in 1919, but in 1915, he was a city light trimmer, and William Turner, who Sean has already talked about as the Wheeling's first Black policeman. Dr. Haskins had been a Democrat until 1893, but had, quote, let's see, I lost my place here. He had, quote, adhered to the Republican Party since. So he was, very well respected within the Black community. Jackson was in the October 1917 edition of the NAACP's The Crisis publication magazine. He was one of the featured men of the month in that edition. The Crisis noted, Jackson, the only colored man on the fire department at Wheeling, West Virginia, has served for 20 years. And they published this picture of Jackson here with this wonderful handlebar mustache in that edition. Jackson was also a bail bondsman and was mentioned in the newspaper frequently in that capacity, most notably in 1918 when he went to Pittsburgh and arrested two alleged murderers, the Hodge brothers, and brought them back to Wheeling in a highly publicized story. In 1938, he became a bailiff to federal Judge William Baker. Baker would later be involved in some of the Bill Lias trials. And in addition to being active in local politics, Ashby was a member of the Black Elks and also a member of the Black Oddfellows. Ashby died the day after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 8th, 1941. He had served on the Wheeling Fire Department for 35 years. He is buried at Peninsula Cemetery, where his gravestone still stands today. All right, and then we're going to take it back to Sean.
Okay. So, the next person I'd like to tell you about is a gentleman named Harry H. Jones. I already mentioned him earlier in the context of the 20th Man speech. We'll get to that in a moment. He was a true Renaissance man, born in 1887 in Wheeling, and graduated from Lincoln School and Lincoln High School here in Wheeling. Went to Oberlin College in Ohio. In 1914, he graduated there. Became a teacher of history and civics at Lincoln, where he earned the nickname professor, and earned his law degree at Howard University in 1929. He married Edith Walker Redmond in 1942. He was also a newspaper editor. He edited a newspaper called The Advocate, which was an African-American paper. And while on the staff, the Pittsburgh Courier said he made the paper felt with his strong dissertations regarding race questions in the community. He wrote for the Courier. He also wrote for the Wheeling Majority, a socialist paper, and an African-American publication called The Crisis, where we found a lot of information you'll be hearing today. As president of the NAACP here in Wheeling in 1919, he praised Governor Cornwell for his stand, the governor's stand, against a double lynching in Huntington, and in support of federal anti-lynching laws known as the Curtis and Dyer bills, which were never passed as far as I can tell. He was the field supervisor of the Civilian Defense for Negro Activities and held a position of clerk, Office of Records of Deeds in Wheeling. He was a member of the Zoning Commission, and he served on the state West Virginia Human Rights Commission. So he did a lot of things, also very active in the Republican Party. And as I mentioned before, here's the article about his praise of the governor. He wrote and delivered the 20th Man speech, which I encourage you to listen to or read. And this is something new that I learned researching his life, he was named the law librarian for the very first law library at the Ohio County Courthouse, which you see him here in 1960 when it opened, filling the shelves with law books. And Used to do a lot of research there. I never knew this about Harry Jones. And he died in 1974 at the age of 87, his wife having passed in 1968. And they are both buried side by side at Greenwood. And I was able to find their headstone and put it on Find a Grave. So Harry Jones, a Wheeling attorney, and so much more. And now I'll hand it back to Aaron. There you go.
Okay, our next featured community leader is Boswell Stillyard. Sometimes in the publications he'll be referred to as Basil or Baswell, but his actual name was Boswell Henson Stillyard. He was a New Year's baby born January 1st, 1847 in Port Tobacco, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. The Crisis magazine that we've mentioned before noted that he was of slave parentage. And, quote, he was an ambitious and self-taught man. He would sit up at night in a fireless room wrapped in a quilt that he might learn how to read and write. And at age 29, he attended the historically black college in D.C., the Howard University. He was there from 1776 to 1777. In 1779, he transferred to Union College in Albany, New York, to study medicine. And in 1881, he transferred back to Howard University to study in their medical department. Here you can see him listed in the senior class in 1882. While he was at Howard University, he published a paper called Hydatids from the Disease of the Corian in Galliard's Medical Journal. And if you didn't understand a word of that, you're not alone. I had to look up the words as well. A hydatid is a watery cyst, and a corian is the outermost membrane of the embryonic placenta. So this was some highly specialized stuff that he was studying while he was at Howard. As I said, he graduated in 1882, and after graduation, he moved to Wheeling, which was still the state capital at the time. It was not until 1885 until the capital moved permanently to Charleston. So he took his exams in Wheeling because that was the state capital, and he passed them June 28th, 1882, and this was under the newly formed West Virginia State Board. And he was licensed to practice medicine by Dr. James Edmund Reeves. And some of you who have been at some of our past Lunch with Books will recognize his name. Reeves became Wheeling's first permanent health officer, appointed in 1869. In 1881, he drafted the West Virginia Board of Health Act and became the state board's first secretary. In 1882, when Dr. Stillyard passed the exams and became licensed under the fledgling board, Reeves had another physician, Frank Dent, who had been a doctor in Fairmont for 6 years when the state board was formed. Reeves had him arrested for practicing medicine without a license. His arrest eventually led to the landmark 1889 U.S. Supreme Court ruling Dent versus West Virginia, which upheld that states can set reasonable requirements for physicians to obtain a medical license in order to practice. So this was the atmosphere in which Stillyard took his exams and entered into the medical profession here in Wheeling. They were really cracking down on standards, and he would have had to go through this rigorous testing to get his license to practice. So it speaks a lot about his education at Howard University. So, though purportedly a Confederate sympathizer, according to the book Professionalizing Medicine, James Reeves and the Choices That Shaped American Healthcare, Reeves appreciated the fact that Wheeling's Black community needed its own physician, and Dr. Stillyard did as well, which brought him here to Wheeling. The Wheeling Register applauded Reeves's licensing of Stillyard, reporting, quote, "A Democratic board was more than willing to give the colored brother a chance," unquote. So shortly after coming to Wheeling, Stillyard quickly gained respect in the community, often listed in the newspaper as a prominent or well-known colored physician of this city. In 1883, he was one of the leaders of an early civil rights meeting held at the Upper Market House, along with Professor Jones and Colonel Alexander Turner, who was the father of policeman Bill Turner. In 1885, he was selected to run for Wheeling City Council, representing the Second Ward, along with H.B. Clemens, who was listed as a delegate for the Second Ward. However, he lost the race. The Intelligencer had called it a thin scheme of the Democrats to try to lure votes away from the Black population of the ward, to lure the votes away from Stillyard to the other Republicans running on the ticket. Stillyard was again asked to run for city council in 1887, but the doctor declined. In 1886, September the 15th, he had married Jenny Meade from Fairmont, West Virginia. The couple moved to Topeka, Kansas in 1888. In addition to West Virginia, he also became licensed to practice medicine in Kansas and Illinois. 3.5 years after moving to Kansas, the couple moved back to Wheeling in 1891 after Jenny's health began to fail. She tragically died at the young age of 27 in February of 1893 after several years of declining health. The orator at her funeral was, there's the, well, I guess I had a slide of Professor James McHenry Jones in there, but it has disappeared. So I'll just tell you. Oh no, there it is. Okay, it's out of sequence. So this is James McHenry Jones, the orator at Jenny's funeral. He was the principal at Lincoln School for many years, and he later became the president of the West Virginia Colored Institute, now West Virginia State University. Some of you might also know him as the author of the novel Hearts of Gold. A year after Jenny's birth, Dr. Stillyard quietly remarried Ada J. Luker, March 4th, 1894. She lived until 1960, and she is buried at Peninsula Cemetery. So Dr. Stillyard's life as a physician had some surprises. In 1892, Stillyard was a group of Wheeling doctors, including Drs. Hupp, Frizzell, and Fulton, who witnessed the hanging of murderer William Joseph Meyer in the old jail yard on Oak Street. The hanging was not public, with only those having tickets of admission being permitted to witness it, and the doctors were part of the men on hand for medical examinations after the execution. The last hanging in Wheeling would occur 5 years later in 1897. Even more disturbing than witnessing the hanging was in 1893, late October. Dr. Stillyard was struck in the neck with a hatchet by a Miss Lucy Robinson. Robinson was said to be delirious, having been believing he had poisoned her. The doctor survived the attack, and Lucy was sentenced to 8 months in jail with a $100 fine. The doctor remained active in local and national politics throughout his life. He was a member of Simpson M.E. Church and for many years the president of its board of trustees. He was Mason and received the highest degrees of that order. He is a founder of the West Virginia Black Scottish Rites Order and was the Grand Master of the Colored Masons for the state of West Virginia, often representing the Black organization at the national level as a delegate or secretary. He was also represented several Fred Douglass organizations and celebrations at the state and national level. In 1912, he was elected to a West Virginia state office as one of the committeemen at large. He was one of three Black committeemen to be chosen from around the state and to serve in that capacity. In 1913, Stillyard again made an attempt to run for City Council's Second Ward. This time it was successful, making him the first known Black member of Wheeling City Council. His election to City Council made national news in the Black media, being noted in the 1913 Negro Yearbook as one of 7 African-American men having been elected to municipal councils that year. Notably, while on council, the NAACP's crisis reported that, quote, during his term as councilman, the elimination of the Wheeling Turf Exchange, which allowed pool hall gambling in Wheeling, was accomplished, and though and although he was offered bribes to cast his vote for its retention, he refused them and cast his vote against its survival. He was at all times devoted to the principles of justice, liberty, and equality, end quote. After his term ended in 1915, his reputation took an unfortunate blow. In 1916, Dr. Stillyard was indicted along with 2 other Black physicians in the city, according to the newspapers. The other 2 doctors were Dr. Kennedy and Dr. Newman. All 3 were charged with performing illegal operations on young girls. The Intelligencer reported, quote, "The latest with which prosecutor has had to deal with is that of Dr. BH Stillyard, colored, in which the doctor is charged with performing an operation upon Miss Gertrude Kemple, a beautiful 18-year-old white girl who died at North Wheeling Hospital Sunday evening." Newspaper accounts later stated both Miss Kemple and Mr. Lowell, the father of the girl's unborn child, are of prominent families. It is understood that Lowell, in a statement to the police, admitted intimacy with the girl and said he had often proposed marriage. Being of a proud disposition and somewhat humiliated at her condition, it is understood she desired another course out of the difficulty, unquote. An inquiry after her death determined that dirty surgical instruments led to blood poisoning, which led to her death. Her death certificate states she officially died of septic peritonitis following criminal abortion. Dr. Stillyard fell ill shortly after being charged and died before he went on trial, his death overruling the indictment. The newspapers claimed his death was over the stress of the situation. His death certificate calls the official cause nephritis. One point of interest that shows what a tight community the Wheeling Black community was is that a person listed on Dr. Stillyard will is Ashby Jackson. So upon Stillyard's death, the Crisis reported, quote, "In his death, Wheeling has lost one of her best citizens, the church a pillar of support, and the race a strong helper," unquote. The Intelligencer, while in the same article reporting on the case, also praised Stillyard's civic contributions, calling him, quote, "a man of more than usual brilliancy. Being of that class of colored people interested in civic welfare, he did much to have better ordinances passed while he was in council. His place among the colored population of the city will be hard to fill." While at Ohio Valley General Hospital in his final days, he was attended to by Dr. Katherine J. Pronty, who is our next featured community leader in this program. So Julia Katherine Pronty was born January 25th, 1888 in Roanoke, Virginia. She attended Meharry Medical College in 1910, one of the nation's oldest and largest historically Black academic health science centers. Located in Nashville, Tennessee, it was founded in 1876 as Meharry Medical Department of Central Tennessee College. Dr. Pronty graduated Meharry College in 1910. Here you can see her name in the commencement program. And unfortunately, this is the best photo that we have of Dr. Pronty. It's from the 1910 graduating class's picture. Dr. Pronty took her exams in Charleston and Morgantown between July and November of 1910, receiving news of passing them in January of 1911. Shortly thereafter, she came to Wheeling via Brownsville, Pennsylvania, where her family had settled. When she first came to Wheeling, she was one of 4 Black doctors listed in the city directory, along with Dr. Stillyard, Dr. E.S. Kennedy, who was one of the other doctors charged in 1916, along with Stillyard, and Dr. J.T. Sawyer. She kept her office in her home at 64 11th Street, but she frequently saw patients at Ohio Valley General Hospital. In 1915, the city celebrated a health week. City Solicitor J. Harold Brennan commented, "No one connected with the city government can fail to take an interest in Health Week celebration and of the different departments of health, which will be discussed from the standpoint of the state, county, and city by eminent physicians. Among those eminent physicians was Dr. Pronty delivering an address on the sidechain theory of immunity, which would be a very appropriate talk for today if she were still around. Her sister Maddie came to Wheeling in 1918 and taught at Lincoln School. Unfortunately, 3 years later, she passed away January 25th, 1922 at OVGH, and she is buried at Greenwood Cemetery. In addition to attending the sick, Dr. Pronty also delivered many babies over her career in Wheeling. One of them was this man here, Everett Lee, who was a groundbreaking African-American conductor of classical music. He was born right here in Wheeling. And in an interview we conducted with him October 2016, he reminisced, "A few days ago, I remember the doctor who delivered me, and her name was Dr. Katherine Pronty. So she delivered him in 1916. He was remembering this right after his 100th birthday. So I think that says a lot about the impact of not only having a female physician, but one that's a part of your community. His parents would have obviously had to talk about her for him to be able to remember the name of the doctor that delivered him 100 years later. In 1913, Dr. Pronty was involved in an incident that illustrates some of the problems of Jim Crow Wheeling. She was assaulted on Market Street by a Caucasian man named George Briding, along with a second man. Briding put his hands in her pockets and his arms around her and refused to let her go. When the policeman came, Briding was released by his own recognizance by a Squire Hobbs. So Pronty did file charges, but the day after she filed those charges, a police officer came to her offices and tried to intimidate her into dropping the charges, claiming the men were incapable of knowing what they were doing because they were drunk and thought she was another woman. So therefore, she should just forget about it because they didn't mean to do it to her, at least. So you can see that the papers didn't take kindly to this, and neither did some of the members of the city council. So a resolution was placed by Dr. W.P. McGrail before city council for a committee to investigate the incident. The resolution was passed, and a jury found Briding guilty. However, the jury also asked the judge that Briding received no jail time, and he was released with a $10 fine. Dr. Pronty died September 6th, 1949. She was 61 years old. She'd been a member of the Ladies Auxiliary Post 89, American Legion. Her husband had been a member of the U.S. Marine Corps in World War I. Around 1919, she had married John H. Davis, druggist on the North Side Pharmacy on Market Street. And sometimes she in her professional life, she went mostly by Dr. Pronty, but sometimes the hyphenated Pronty Davis. So her husband, John Pronty, continued to live at 64 11th Street until his death in 1965, and they are both buried at Stone Church Cemetery. And now we'll let Sean talk about our next person.
We're working against each other, but I just wanted to, first of all, the North Side Pharmacy, that was Doc White's pharmacy in the neighborhood. Many of you may be familiar with Doc White, who's in the Wheeling Hall of Fame, and that's where John Davis was a druggist. But I wanted to go back to BH Stillyard. Dr. Stillyard, a remarkable man, and you heard his career, and he, unfortunately, and I think, and you can speculate on what happened, but the facts are clear. A pregnant 18-year-old white girl went to him for an illegal abortion, and she died, and he took the fall for it. And it happened to several doctors, as you heard, during Jim Crow. She came from
all within a few months of each other.
Right, and she came from a prominent white family. So you connect the dots. But this man deserves to be remembered and would probably be in the Wheeling Hall of Fame but for that, and probably would have been remembered because we think of the first black city councilman as Clyde Thomas, and he was of the modern era because he was elected 60 years later in the 70s. That's how long it took. And, city council was different then. It was bicameral and there were more people involved. But the fact is, BH Stillyard was the first black city council person in Wheeling. And
and nobody's heard of him. When Clyde Thomas ran, they really thought, or was elected, everybody really did think he was the first black member of city council.
Yeah. So I wanted to commend Erin for finding that in her research. She was researching, as so often happens, something else and found that. And also correcting the error that Mr. Dorfmeyer was the first black fireman in Wheeling when it was actually Ashby Jackson. But, we can't really be faulted for not remembering BH Stillyard, but let me put my, let's move on. The next person I mentioned, Clyde Thomas, and his wife Anne was a friend of mine whom I interviewed a few times. And when I talked to her one time, she said, we had black physicians. And she said, we had a black dentist, Wade Hamlin, who was a classmate of mine, of hers. His father was a dentist. That's his father you see here, RM, or Robert Maceo Hamlin. And his mother, Wade Hamlin's mother, was also a doctor, an MD. But if any of her patients, this is Ann Thomas, quote, if any of Dr. Hamlin's patients had to be put in the hospital, she had to get a white colleague to admit them because she had no hospital privileges. So there again, and that's how I first learned of the Hamlins. RM, who you see here in his military uniform, was born in Charleston and graduated from West Virginia State College and Howard University Med School. Started practicing dentistry in 1924. He was active in politics and became president of the Negro Republican Party of Ohio County. And in a 1944 article, he was quoted as saying, the Negro doesn't want to be a Democrat. Now, again, as we spoke earlier, it's quite the reverse now. But at the time, he said the name Democrat is distasteful to him because of the harsh treatment of the Democratic South. It wouldn't take a lot to make him a loyal Republican, but he must have something more than a pat on the back and a drink of liquor just before Election Day. Dr. Hamlin advocated for housing, training for industrial jobs for black people. He complained that about Jim Crow, that they couldn't go to movies and there were no recreational facilities for African Americans, and that white foreigners, by which he meant immigrants, were treated better than black people in town. He was a city council candidate as well in 1943. This is his ad, and I like it because it says, it's very subtle, Dr. R.M. Hamlin, a vote for Dr. R.M. Hamlin for council will be appreciated. And that's enough, isn't it? He was a commander at the American Legion Post 89, which was the African American post. And local veterans, both white and black, when a city pool was going to be built, a segregated pool for black people, they wanted to name the pool after him, the revered leader and civic veteran and other bodies. Apparently, this pool was never built, but the fact that both white and black veterans wanted him to be honored says something about him. And this is his wife, Alga Wade Hamlin, MD, who, much like Katherine Pronty before her, attended and graduated from Meharry Medical College. Here's her graduating class. And this is from their library and archives. They were very helpful for us. This is, of course, one of the nation's oldest and largest historically black academic health science centers in Nashville, Tennessee. She, Dr. Hamlin, or Dr. Wade at the time, interned in Durham, North Carolina, moved to Wheeling in 1937, and married Robert Hamlin. She was known as a prominent woman specialist and conducted clinics on health of babies, children, and women all over the Ohio Valley. She died in 1983 and is buried next to her husband in Mount Rose Cemetery in Moundsville. And We give it back to Aaron.
Okay, we have one person left to talk about here today, and that person is Will H. Dixon, a famed musician, composer, stage conductor, and pianist at the turn of the 20th century. Prior to Cab Calloway's birth, he was dubbed the original dancing conductor by James Weldon Johnson, who was an American writer, civil rights activist, and an early leader of the NAACP. And he was born right here in Wheeling, August 29th, 1879. His parents were John Dixon and Mary Putnam. They were married in Wheeling, June 27th, 1872. His father worked as a barber, a bath attendant, and a porter at the McClure Hotel. The family lived at 1045 and 1038 Oak Street before moving to Chicago around 1892. Will would have been about 13 years old when the family left Wheeling. In 1900, Will, aged 21, left home to try to make a living using his musical talents. He moved to New York City. Like nearly all African Americans of his generation, his entry into the show business was through minstrelry. Minstrel shows, traditionally musical comedy plays, featured performers both black and white, wearing blackface. Black performers often had to act out these heartbreaking stereotypes mocking African American people to make a living. In her book, Staging Race, author Karen Sideropoulos notes, quote, "For Black Americans, the 1890s ushered in a decade of shrinking possibilities, and artists and activists alike desperately sought any avenue for advancement," unquote. So many African American artists saw the minstrel stage as their chance to get their foot in the door in the entertainment industry, and also to secure some sort of financial to establish some sort of financial security. And this was the case for Dixon, whose first job was singing with Phil R. Miller's incredibly, unfortunately named Hottest Coon in Dixie Company. However, as a multi-talented and multi-acclaimed singer, pianist, conductor, actor, comedian, playwright, and composer of both classical and popular music, Dixon soon rose to fame as a central figure in Black Manhattan, and in the early 20th century. With his exceptional talents, he quickly caught and held the attention of the African American press, often being referenced in the newspapers, the African American newspapers. By 1902, he was singing, acting, and writing his own plays. Oh, here he's the musical director of a minstrel show here in this slide. But by 1902, he was writing his own plays and songs. This one here, recorded on Columbia Records, "Don't Make Me Laugh," Bill. We'll hear a little clip of that later. And he also, around this time, started composing musical comedies with a partner, Chicago's noted Black lyricist Alfred Anderson. And here on the left, you can see a program for their musical satire, Count of No Account. And on the left is a manuscript for a song that they wrote together, Pal O' Mine. In the spring of 1904, white America also started paying attention to Dixon, and one of the country's foremost music publishers in New York bought and published several of the Dixon Anderson songs. Now, again, these were made for the minstrelry audience, so it's uncomfortable for us to see the sheet music today with the blackface, but that was just how the times were. To make the money, they had to accommodate what was wanted at the time. In 1905, he began performing with the Memphis Students Troupe, who toured in Europe. While he was there, both he and his fellow musicians would have enjoyed much more racial freedom in Europe than they experienced in America. And Dixon really took in the culture of Europe. And when he came back to America, his music had a much more sort of sophisticated European sound, where before he was doing more of the minstrelry and more American sounds. His music took on a much more European flair when he came back. So Dixon returned to Chicago briefly at the end of 1906 after spending a year in Europe, before heading back to New York City in 1907. The New York Age, which was one of the most prominent Black newspapers at the time, called Dixon, quote, "chock full of ambition," unquote. And by 1909, he was regarded as a full-fledged celebrity actor, singer in the African American theater. That same year, in 1909, John Philip Sousa, a composer and conductor primarily known for his American military marches, he proclaimed in the New York Times that ragtime music was dead. And Dixon was one of 5 successful Black composers at the time who refuted Sousa. Um, and it's interesting to note that the list strangely did not include Scott Joplin at the time, who maybe is the best known ragtime composer of his age, even though Joplin was living in New York City, but he was not one of these 5 Black composers to refute Sousa. But these men printed an article in the New York Age, and Dixon, in his piece, noted that, quote, "the melodious compositions in syncopated rhythm shall never cease to be pleasing to the ear of a music-loving public." And I think if Sousa was alive today, that he would have found that Dixon's words to be true. The ragtime music with that syncopation led to all types of jazz, and we wouldn't have Gershwin and any of that without those foundings. So another one of Dixon's accomplishments, he was a founding member of the famed Clef Club. He was a key leader within the organization and was the stage director for their October 1910 exhibition concert. He was also one of the 10-member piano section of the Clef Club Symphony Orchestra's now legendary 1912 Carnegie Hall debut, and this was the first time an African-American orchestra had played at Carnegie Hall. He, like so many of the other people we've talked about today, died unfortunately young at the age of 38. At the time, they called it, euphemistically called what he died of mental trouble, but it was actually final stage syphilis. He died May 14th, 1917, and he had returned home to Chicago before he died to be cared for by his mother on his deathbed. Just a few months previous to his death in Chicago, the Chicago Defender called him, quote, "gentlemanly, courteous, and affable, ever ready to give a helping hand to the fellow farther down. It is to be wondered at that his friends are numbered by the hundreds, and that those who have not had the rare good fortune to know him personally have enjoyed the fruits of his efforts in a musical way. For Mr. Dixon is a composer whose fame has spread over both continents." And we're going to end the program playing a few clips of his music, and you'll be able to hear that transition from the early American music into the more European sounding. But before we do that, we'd like to personally thank Mr. Lawrence Levins, who he contacted us asking if we could find some information on the Levins or the Dixon family's time in Wheeling, and told us all about Will H. Dixon and sent us a lot of material about him. So we're indebted to Mr. Levins for everything that we know about Mr. Dixon. He also let us know that the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, which is a modern group, has recorded several of Dixon's songs, and they are on a 3 CD set called Black Manhattan that we ordered at the library. So those are available to check out if you want to listen to some of these songs. You can contact the library and do that. But so without further ado, I'm going to play you some of Will Dixon's songs here.
Bill Jones was one more rounder. He always had some dodge. He'd stagger home at 3 a.m. and swear he'd joined some lodge. One morn his wifey nailed him as the milkman helped him in. It took poor Jonesy off his feet. All he could do was grin. At last he said, "Now dearie, I've joined the milkman's club. I say to milk the cows and calves." His wife said, "Quit your noise. Don't make me laugh, Bill. Don't make me laugh. If you don't stop top. I swear I'll drop and crack my sides in half.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to thank everyone for your attention today. And again, it's on us to remember these people who have largely been forgotten and lost to time. So, again, if you have knowledge or photographs to share about any of the people you saw today or any other people from the African American community or just generally from Wheeling, please contact us at the Ohio County Public Library and Archives. And I want to remind everyone before we go that this Thursday evening at 6:30, my little sister, Dr. Erin Duffy, who is a prominent scientist in the field of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, will tell us all about her work. Do not miss. Okay, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Erin. And thanks, everyone who attended. Have a good day. We'll see you next